So, why are capital reserves important? Let me start off by asking, how many of you have a capital reserve account in your annual budget every year? Okay, God bless you. That's great. Then you probably all can leave. Everyone else can stay. Capital reserves are incredibly important, and it is too often that forgotten piece of what's necessary in our budget. We think that because we call it the house of God, that God will just miraculously fix things when they need fixed and repair stuff when they need fixed. And unfortunately, that's not how our culture and world works. So, when we look at the life cycle of any facility, we have the planning piece, which is the fun piece. That's the thing that your pastors back home just love doing. Oh, what if we could do this? What if we could do that? And wouldn't red look great there and purple here? And so on and so forth. Then you get into the design, construction, you do commissioning, you have to do your facility management, and that's where things start falling apart. We have a great time from here, well, to here. This can be sometimes a little frustrating. But this is where we generally stub our toe along the way, is in that facility management piece. And too often in churches, we think we're doing facility management, and what we're actually doing is facility maintenance and not facility management. And there's a significant difference. Maintenance is something that's reactive. Management is something that's proactive. Okay? So, we go through this dreaming stage of, oh, what if we could do this with our facilities? And we plan it, we hire architects, and we get it built. But it's that long-term sustaining piece, and it is the most expensive part of owning a building. People get all uptight about, oh, we're going to have to spend an extra $1 a square foot for this or that, or the architect wants to charge an extra 0.5% for their services, where when you look at the long-term impact of the cost of a project, that's really pretty minute. So I want to show you an example of the real cost of ownership on a building. This is a hypothetical example that I did for Church Executive Magazine several years ago. So let's say we're going to build a 30,000 square foot building, and let's say that the building is going to cost $145 a square foot. Now, if you're in Manhattan, you're going to laugh at me, okay? And if you're in Idaho, I'm probably overshot. But let's just use 145 for somewhere in where I live, where God vacations in North Carolina. $145 a square foot, which we also got a superior rating, right? Our chapter got superior rating this year. No one's clapping? Thank you, Jennifer. Let's assume that we've got 7% architectural and design and engineering fees. So for our 30,000 square foot building, we're going to spend just under $4.7 million for the building and design. Everybody tracking so far? Okay. So let's assume that of that $4.7 million, I'm going to borrow $3 million. I'm going to borrow less than 70%. And I'm going to do a 15-year amortization and just use 6% for right now, although you should be able to get 4.5 easy all day long right now. But I'm going to pay it off in 7 years. We're going to do back-to-back campaigns. We're going to get the thing paid off. So during that duration, I'm going to spend $1.1 million in what I would call the cost of money. Okay? Now, we're going to look at operations costs. You should be budgeting somewhere between $5.25 and $7.50 a square foot annually to take care of janitorial, utilities, general maintenance, and capital reserves. Now, these numbers generally do not include your managerial staff, your grounds, or your insurance. So you need to add those onto it. And when I say managerial staff, I mean a true facility manager who's not carrying a tool belt fixing light bulbs. Okay, so if that's the kind of facility manager you have, they're not included in this number. If your facility manager is the same guy that's unplugging a toilet and changing light bulbs, then yes, he would be included in this number. Everybody good with that?
What are you including in grounds?
Grounds would be your cutting, blowing, trimming, mulching, and that kind of stuff. Generally, you should figure about $5,000 to $5,500 per developed acre for grounds. $5,000 to $5,500 per developed acre annually. Now that's obviously going to vary. If I'm in Maine, I'm probably going to have a little bit more in snow removal than if I'm in Orlando. But if I'm in Arizona and I've got to buy more cactus to keep my campus looking nice, then I may have different costs there. So it's going to vary across the board. And I base that on developed acres, not your total acreage. You might have a 50-acre site and only 15 acres of it is developed. The other 35 acres you don't do anything with. So base it on your developed acreage. So we've got our operations. I'm generally assuming, just rule of thumb, and these guys are going to show you more practical sides of the capital reserves, between $1 and $2 a square foot for capital reserves. So your total operations costs are going to be somewhere between $6.25 and $9.50 a square foot. So real quick, think how many square feet do you have in your building? Multiply that in your head real quick, if you can. Take your shoes off if you need help. And tell me real quick, how many of you have that much budgeted annually? Anybody? Okay, then you are in the right class. Okay, so I'm going to use an assumption of $7 a square foot for my operational costs. That's $210,000 annually for my 30,000 square foot building to take care of all those things. Let's assume that this is a 40-year assessment. If you don't plan that your buildings are going to last at least 40 years, please do not build a building. Go buy a tent, go rent a school. Okay, buildings are meant to last 40, 50 years and beyond. So assume it's a 40-year time consumption. And let's look at a 1.5% annual inflation rate, which I think is probably on the low side. It probably was fine for the last 5 years, but even this year right now, we're seeing the cost of inflation in construction going up at a drastic rate. So if you are planning a building project and you haven't built in 3 to 5% of inflation, if you haven't broken ground already, you're going to be short at the end of the day. You need to plan that into your budget right now for an inflation. So our initial cost is $4.654 million. The cost of money is $1,100,000. The cost of operations over that 40-year period of time is $13.4 million to operate your $4.7 million building. So we spent $145 to build it, and we're going to spend $448 a square foot to operate it. Where should we spend our efforts when we're looking at building new buildings? Obviously, if we don't go into the design and construction of our buildings with the understanding of the long-term operational cost, we're short-sighted. Don't let someone plan a 40-foot chandelier in your building without a plan to how to change the light bulbs. Okay? You need to think through those things, and don't get hung up on that extra $1 a square foot if you can save $10 a square foot long-term over the life of the building. Now, every church has a limited budget. I've been doing this 28 years. I'm yet to find a church with an unlimited budget. When I do, I'm going to build them a building, I'm going to retire. But until that day, every church I've ever worked with has a finite amount of money they can work with. So, as you make a value decision as you look at your buildings, and you decide you really have to have a little more square footage or you need some additional space, and in order to do that, you have to skinny back on some other component of the building. Let's say you decide to use the cheapest carpet known to mankind. Okay, you go to Home Depot and you buy their $1 a yard carpet. That's fine, that's a value decision, but understand that you need to start saving money from day one because in 3 years you will replace it. Okay, so just understand that there is a value, cost, and long-term operational component that goes with that. So our total cost of owning our $4 million building is almost $20 million over 40 years. If your boards, your elders, your sessions, whoever's your hierarchy doesn't grasp this, I have a sledgehammer that I'm willing to lend to you that you can hit them over the head with. Because this is critical stuff that people they forget. So when you look at the total cost of ownership over 40 years, your initial sticks and bricks is only 20% of your total cost of ownership. The cost of financing, that interest that we paid on the loan, is only about 6%. The cost of your architect and your construction manager and everything else is less than 3%, and yet that's where we get our panties in a wad when it's time to get a project going. And about 71+% is the cost of operations. To me, that's very daunting when I look at that. And then I look at churches' budgets, and I see that there's not appropriate monies being set aside for that long-term planning. After I published the article, I got a call from Allstate, for State Farm. State Farm has a division in Chicago that's made up of architects, contractors, facility managers, and environmental folks. They manage all of their buildings across the United States. I got a call from one of their guys after reading my article that said, we just finished our regression analysis over our buildings that are 40 and 50 years old. They found that 80% of their cost was operations. Now, they included insurance in their number, where my 71% didn't have insurance, so it wouldn't surprise me. Then I found a book that was written in 1965 by an architect. I actually didn't find the book, I found the cover of the book. His premise is that 85% is operational cost when you go 40 years and longer on buildings. So my 71% is probably a little on the skinny side, but if you assume it's going to be somewhere between 71 and 85% of the ownership of a building over 40 years is going to be an operational cost. So let's look at a couple. I told Glenn and Keith earlier, this is a church business administrator, so I've got to use some scripture just to justify myself here. But if we go to 2 Kings, Josiah said to the priests, collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord, the money collected in the census, the money received from personal vows, and the money brought voluntarily to the temple. Let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers, then use it to repair whatever is damaged and found in the temple. But by the 23rd year of King Josiah, the priests still had not repaired the temple. It sounds like most church boards. So, we've been collecting this money year in and year out, and yet we've done nothing about it. Okay? Can anybody relate? Okay. Therefore, King Josiah summoned that guy, the priest, and the other priests, and asked them, why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Take no more money from the treasurers, but hand it over for repairing the temple. I like that. The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money from the people, and they would not repair the temple themselves. The PS is mine. They actually hired people to do the work. This was not a DIY event, okay? They actually hired professionals to get it done. Just because Bubba built a garage does not mean he's qualified to help rebuild your church, okay? By the way, the original facility managers were considered holy men. In Numbers, the Levites were called to be the first facility guys. Those two clans were responsible to care for the tabernacle, including the sacred tent with its layers of coverings, the curtain at its entrance, the curtains of the courtyard that surrounded the tabernacle and altar, the curtain at the courtyard entrance, the ropes, and all the equipment related to their use. These four clans, you got to read the whole thing to get the context, but the four clans were responsible for the care of the ark, the table, the lampstands, the altars, the various articles used in the sanctuary, the inner curtain, and all of the equipment related to their use. Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, was the chief administrator over all the Levites with special responsibility for the oversight of the sanctuary. Book of Numbers tells us who the first facility managers were. They weren't the other 11 tribes. They were the priests. Today, most of our facility managers are redheaded stepchildren on our staff. We give them... Okay, blonde-haired stepchildren of the staff. They too often are the guys or gals that are given the garage office or the dungeon office. And they're the necessary evil that we have to have on our staff instead of seeing them as an important part of our staff. How many of your ministries could continue to survive if your buildings were shut down and condemned because they weren't usable? The building is nothing more than a tool, but without the right tools, a workman can't get the job done. So we need to make sure that we're keeping our tools up and appropriate. So let's look at capital reserves. That was just the intro. I feel like a preacher. That was just the first part of the scripture. Now we're going to dig into the meat here. This is the definition from capital reserves. It's an amount of money that a company or organization keeps in a special account for future needs. I've underlined 3 specific parts of this that we need to grasp. Number 1, it's money, it's dollars, it's greenbacks, it's currency, it's not hopeful thinking. Okay? A capital reserve is money. The second thing is it's set aside in a special account, something designated for capital reserves. Third, it's for the future. That means down the road, somewhere that I can't see yet. Those three attributes are the critical components of capital reserve planning. So you are planning for the future, so you need to establish a special account so that you have the money for the future. Everybody tracking? Your capital reserve fund is not a rainy day fund. It is not the, we want to start a new mission or a new ministry, and so we're going to rob our capital reserve fund to hire a new staff person. Caveat, if that's the decision of your leaders, that's fine. It's your church's money. But don't assume that you're not going to need that money at some point in time. Every air conditioner in your building will be replaced. Every stitch of carpet at some point will be replaced. You will have to replace everything at some point in time in your building. So why not have the money to do it? So here's some facts. Anybody here from Detroit? This is actually a church in Detroit. Kind of a sad picture. But all buildings deteriorate at an annual rate of 1% to 4% a year. Now, that's not any church building, that's any building. That's our homes, that's our offices, our hospitals, our warehouses. They all deteriorate at a natural rate of deterioration of 1% to 4% per year. You also have to base your deterioration on what's called the current replacement value, CRV. Current replacement value is what's it worth today? What is the building worth today? And let me go back to that for a second. You don't want to assume, our building was built in 1960, and back then it was built for $1 million. So let's base our capital reserve planning on a $1 million building. You need to base your building on what would it cost today to replace it in today's dollars. My guess is your insurance company is already requiring you to have that kind of thinking for your insurance policy. That's the same numbers you need to be thinking about when you're creating your current replacement value and you're looking at what capital reserves need to be. And that's Glenn on the front row, by the way. We told you he's been here a long time. In addition, if you don't keep up with the natural rate of deterioration, it can more than double. I'll give you a prime example. I had a church outside of Hilton Head that I had built in the 90s, and they had decided to use really inexpensive value-based windows. So they went with all wood windows. And I came back about 10 years later to build another phase for them. And they said, can you come look at these other windows? They're not opening real well. So we went over and they're not opening and some of them cracked and so on and so forth. I said, well, when was the last time you painted and caulked the windows? Huh? You know, caulk's good for 1 year, just so you know. They hadn't done anything for 10 years. So I did a regression analysis and said, okay, how many man hours would it take every year to caulk those windows and repaint them, and how much would it cost? So we figured about 16 to 18 hours, and if you use your normal staff rate, whatever that happens to be, and it was about 10 tubes of caulk. It came out to be about $365 to $400 a year. So over 10 years, they just spent $3,600 to $4,000. Instead, they spent $25,000 to replace the windows. So the rate of deterioration, when not taken into account on its annual basis, multiplies and multiplies. You get that little leak around your window sills or doors, and you don't think much about it. But what's happening when that water gets in the wall? You get mold, you get rot. Now all of a sudden, instead of that little maintenance type thing that's an irritant that we really don't want to have to deal with, becomes a massive project that you have to do a capital campaign just to raise enough money to do that. We failed to see what real facility stewardship is about. We think that we're being wise by not spending money to annually take care of our buildings at its natural rate of deterioration, but somehow or another, magically, we were able to raise $25,000 to replace our windows when if we could have spent $3,000 or $4,000 in that same period of time. To me, it just doesn't seem to make sense to be doing that.